Hello and welcome to Personable, a podcast focused on speaking to the world's best, enabling you to become the best that you can be. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Aaron Dinin. Dr. Aaron Dinin is a senior lecturing fellow at Duke University who teaches entrepreneurship with a focus on social marketing and personal brand building, with courses that have been featured by The Today Show, Bloomberg, Wired Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, and The Cosmopolitan. He has a PhD in English and over 400,000 online followers across TikTok, Instagram, Medium, and more. He is also the co-founder and lead developer of Rocket Bolt. He has a novel that he made in his senior year of Duke, and he also happens to be my professor. Thank you very much, Dr. Dinin, for joining me today. I was wondering if you could take me on the journey through what brought you to Duke and got you into the startup world.
Oh, thanks for having me, Harvey. And I love when my students are doing cool projects like this. One thing, sorry, this is totally a tangent, but I heard this great piece of wisdom the other day, which is the longer someone's bio is, the less interesting it is to hear from them. And as you were reading through my bio, I'm like, oh, he just keeps going. Yeah, it must not be very interesting to hear from. Yeah. But you think about it, right? Like if, let's say you were interviewing Barack Obama, you'd just be like, today we have, Barack Obama, 44th, 45th president of the United States. And that's it, right? You wouldn't need to say anything else he did. You would just know. And you'd be like, oh, this is an interesting interview. So sorry my bio is long. I'll work on making it shorter.
No, I was planning on interviewing Barack Obama next week, and I was looking into his what school he went to, his middle school, his elementary school, his blood type. So I had a really long list. So I made yours shorter because I thought you were comparatively a lot more interesting.
Thank you. Well, you know what? I'd be happy just being the warm-up app for a president. I'll take any president, even dead ones. That's fine. God, sorry. So ask your question again. I've now.
So yeah, my question was if you could take me through the journey through Duke and how you got into the startup world.
Oh gosh. Well, so I feel like I have a little weird journey because I was an undergrad at Duke, and then I've come back, and now I'm faculty at Duke, and so it's kind of a weird. It's really, one thing I'll tell you, it is very strange to teach where you were an undergrad because when you're. I shouldn't be saying this to my student, I imagine, but when you're sitting in the class, you just imagine your teacher knows so much, and they've got their life together and things like that. And then when you reverse roles and you're standing in front of the classroom, you realize, oh wait, I'm supposed to teach something today. I don't know what I'm talking about on this one, but I'm going to pretend. I'm going to fake it. I was chasing around my dog trying to clean up his poop, and my child trying to clean up her poop, and my life is just covered in poop at home. And then I get to school and university, and now I'm supposed to be the professor who has it all, in command and under control. But back as an undergrad, I came to Duke. I was early decision here at Duke. I got here. I was going to be a doctor like everyone else, and I was pre-med, and I was taking freshman organic chemistry, and I have to admit I wasn't loving it. That's no shade to people who do love their organic chemistry. It was not my favorite thing. I don't think I'm wildly alone in that. And then I also, just to get there's an ALP credit, arts language credit, something like that I had to get for the curriculum requirements at the time at Duke. And so I had to take a class on Walt Whitman. It just happened to be it happened to be open and fit my schedule. And I vaguely remember I'd heard of the guy, the famous 19th century American poet. And at some point I came to the realization, oh my gosh, I like this class on Walt Whitman a lot better than I like this class on organic chemistry. And I'm proud to say I had a good enough sense to go, oh, maybe that means I don't need to be a doctor. Maybe that means that's not my career path. Whereas I feel like a lot of the students I work with, they don't quite get to that realization. They just think that they came in saying they were going to do something, so they got to do it. And that's never true. And then so I kind of went on this journey. And the great thing, I call entrepreneurship like a 21st century branding of humanities. And so I wound up becoming an English major and a humanist, and I was studying Dickinson and Whitman and Thoreau and Emerson and Shakespeare and all those people. But I argue that the lessons I learned studying all that stuff were wonderful at preparing me to be a great kind of the entrepreneurial world, because just like in humanities and reading a poem, there's no right or wrong. It's all about kind of interpretation and making decisions based on what information you have, and trying to understand people's stories and leverage those stories and kind of explore those stories. And that's what entrepreneurship is. A lot of people think entrepreneurship is the domain of engineers and go build a great product, and that's just not true. Entrepreneurship is about understanding people and their problems and then figuring out how to solve those problems. Now, sometimes the way you solve those problems is with a coolly engineered product, but that comes in the service of understanding people's stories and their problems. And so that's kind of how I got into the entrepreneur world. I never made a conscious decision that I'm going to be an entrepreneur today. You know, I get high schoolers who come to me and they'll hand me their business card, and their business card will say entrepreneur on it. And I'm like, oh, really? Tell me more about this, this title you put on your business card here. But, I found the best entrepreneurs in the world don't really call themselves entrepreneurs. They tend to call them, they're there because they found something that they're passionate about, a problem that they want to solve, and they're focused on solving it. And then other people call them entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I think that's a very common thread these days with everyone calling themselves entrepreneurs or hustlers. Maybe if they're younger, buying and selling, secondhand shoes. I actually used to do that as myself. So maybe I am an entrepreneur, maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm just a self-proclaimed person. But I'd be curious on, what made that difference between you being a self-proclaimed entrepreneur and you actually becoming, successful in that route.
Well, the few things we got to ask is, am I successful? I don't know. And success is always relative, because what happens is, I like it in the social media, right? Is, if you had told me, 2-3 years ago, oh, you're going to have 500,000 followers, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And now that I'm here, I'm like, oh man, I only have 500,000 followers. How do I get more, right? And so the bar keeps moving, and you keep chasing the next thing, and so you never really feel successful. And this is something I noticed when I had a podcast for a little while where I interviewed lots of successful entrepreneurs. One of the most amazing things I found is, I'd be sitting there talking to a billionaire who could just be retired and doing whatever, and yet what they were always excited about is like their next startup. And so I think success is, God, this is such a cliche, but success is the journey. It's not the outcome in the entrepreneurial world. And the real entrepreneurs they're obsessed with doing, with building, with solving problems. And there's like this reward that kind of comes with it, but it's not the goal. And you can be just as quote unquote successful having never launched a company that, that went anywhere, as you can having launched, a company worth billions of dollars, precisely because success is in the process. And so as long as you're enjoying the process, you're wildly successful.
Something that's been, termed, I think, by Gen Z and, popular figures such as Andrew Tate, has been this idea of escaping the matrix, with the 9 to 5, being this sort of like modern day slavery in which people are forced to work these, these jobs that are made to seem rather boring. And then you see, entrepreneurship as the complete contradiction to that, the escape from this, this universe, in being able to have the freedom to do what you want to do. You left that world, entered into the entrepreneurship world, and then have come back. I was wondering if you could take me on the story of why you left that world, in which other people would see as success, to come back and teach at Duke University.
I try not to rank too much of my life in relation to Andrew Tate, so we'll be careful about this. Tread lightly. It's the idea actually goes back, I think, a little farther to it's not Andrew Tate, it's Tim Ferriss, who 4-Hour Workweek was, I think, where you get the kind of the germination out of it is a lifestyle design, I believe is what he termed it. And I don't think he invented it, but he certainly popularized the concept. And 4-Hour Workweek, mind you, is not about working 4 hours a week. It is about, kind of being, efficient in how you operate in life, and, and recognizing that this model of I'm going to work, I'm going to save, and then I'm going to retire when I'm 65, and now I'm retired, now I'm going to go do all the things I want to do until I die. That's basically what we want to get away from. And so I would argue that that's exactly what I've escaped from, even being here at Duke University, right? Which was, I wake up every morning and I am thrilled to work with some of the most talented, exceptional, amazing, incredible, articulate students in the world, as well as students like you, Harvey. And the sorry, I was really that whole answer was just to set that joke up. But yeah, it's I do not make as much money from my paycheck at Duke as I would and have in other jobs. And you know what? But I've never been more excited to wake up every day, and I've never been more sad about going to sleep every night than I am in this job, because I do love working with students like you, and it makes me happy, and there's so much more value in that than escaping the 9 to 5 or whatever it is. But here's the funny thing: is so many entrepreneurs come to me, so many, and they say, I want to be an entrepreneur because I want to be my own boss. If you want to be an entrepreneur because you want to be your own boss, you fundamentally misunderstand entrepreneurship. You have infinitely more bosses when you're an entrepreneur than I have right now. I have one boss. As long as she's happy, I got a job. And so I work hard to make sure she's happy. However, when I was running my own companies, I had the freedom, the freedom that we so admire. Well, actually, I was working. I never got to do for myself. I was always doing for other people. My customers were the most important bosses were my customers. Right? Is at the end of the day, I had to make sure I was creating value for them, because if I wasn't creating value for them, I didn't have customers. I didn't have a business, so they were my boss. My employees were my bosses, right? I had to make sure that they were getting their paychecks every month, and if they weren't getting their paychecks, they couldn't feed their families. So I had to work for them, and because I was in venture-backed companies, I had investors, and those investors owned a part of my company. They didn't write $1 million checks with no strings attached. Hey, enjoy your life. It was like, no, we have expectations now, and so they were my bosses too. I had so many bosses when I was running my own company, and now I said there's just one person that needs to stay happy, and so I would ask you to question. I would ask anyone listening to this to question that idea that, hey, I'm an entrepreneur because I want to be my own boss.
I think something that, aside from being a professor, that many people know you for is your social media presence. Before we get into how and why you started posting on social media, I would love if you could do something that you've actually asked me to do in the past, is to define social media.
Ooh. So it's I actually I've started to increasingly hate the term. I can't. It's just media, right? And we called it social media because that was like a brand we were putting on this kind of new form of media. But honestly, it's media. And what is media? Well, media is entertainment and culture and dissemination of knowledge. It's functionally storytelling. Media is storytelling. It's the communication and transmission of knowledge across communities, across people, and across generations. And so social media is kind of these certain platforms of basically community storytelling. And so the interesting thing about social media is basically there's been 3, and there is a scholar that I can't remember the scholar's name, and so but I just want everyone listening to this to know I'm not taking credit for this brilliant observation. It is out there, and Google it and find it, and I should probably go do that. But there's punctually been 3 major shifts in communication technology in all of human history, right? Fundamental communication paradigms. The first was one-to-one. That's the invention of spoken language, right? We didn't come out of the primordial ooze being able to have this conversation, right? That was a technology that we developed, and we built this thing called language, where we could, start out a series of grunts and pointing, and it slowly evolved in this really complex thing that allows us to transmit information between each other. And then thousands of years later, we developed a written language. And now with written language, you can suddenly go from one to many. So we had one-to-one, and then we moved to one to many. And then one to many was there for thousands and thousands of years, not as many thousands of years. And then we developed what we're in now, which is many to many. And that's a big paradigm shift, right? There's only been 3 of these in all of human history, and so we just happen to be going through this big paradigm shift. And so social media is media transferred into this kind of many to many context.
Yeah, actually, a similar sort of thing. I'm going to pronounce his name wrong. So he's called Chamath, I think. Not going to try and pronounce his last name, but he's a venture capital investor who's the host of the All In podcast. And he was actually describing about these systems in which you had companies, like Apple and Google. That was the first shift. The second shift is now you have the apps on the sites. So you have Instagram, you have Netflix, you have Facebook. And then the next shift, in which he's saying is going to be this seismic shift, is the creators, in which now the people on these platforms are the ones that are going to go about bringing in lots and lots of revenue. On that point, I'd love for you to talk about why social media. I mean, social media takes up, average of like hours a day in consumption for the average person, but yet you've actually gone about posting on it, and you've seen all the success with building your own companies. So why spend all this time with social media? How did you go about starting, and how have you become successful from it?
I love the stat. Let me see if I can pull it up here. So TikTok does something fun, whereas it aggregates the watch time of a video. So my most watched video on TikTok looks like it has 23.3 million views over there. And mind you, this isn't even including the 10 million or so it has on Instagram. But so total playtime. Oh my gosh, we're losing. The number has gotten so big that it doesn't exist anymore. Like, I think you just can't calculate it. Oh man, that's such a fun video. Well, here we can put it into context with maybe a smaller video. So I'll take one that has 4.2 million views, and the total playtime for this 4.2 million view video is 16,932 hours of human life. So 16,932 hours. So let's call that. So let's just do the math here. 16,932 divided by 24 is so 705 days. Wait.
Yeah,
I feel like
I think that's right. That's right.
Yeah, 705 days of like human productivity have just been sucked away. Thanks to that, that one video. And, and again, that was only a 4 millionaire. So, I've got a few that have, 30 million views. So, I imagine how many years of productivity I've stolen off of this world. And I'm a small creator. So sorry, your question was why do it?
No, my question was, why are you stealing all this time from human productivity? No, I'm kidding.
Why
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. My actual question was, how and why did you start on social media, and then how have you subsequently become successful from it?
So there's this phrase in business that we've all heard before, right? It's the customer is always right. And a lot of people misunderstand that phrase. They hear it and they're like, oh, it's just give the customer whatever they want because they said it. It's like, no. That's not really what it means. The customer is always right is a mantra to say, like, you can't change how the customer is going to behave, interact, see the world, do things. And so you can either try to fight it, but if you fight it, like, good luck for you. Or you can embrace it and meet the customer where they are, right? The customer's always right means meet the customer where they are. And so what social media, so what I realized is, my customer, as it were, my students, I don't love calling you customers, but my constituency, the people I'm trying to reach, well, as you noted, you're spending hours and hours a day on these platforms. And so am I just going to be like, no, stop looking at those platforms and come over here and look at me? Or I can say, you know what? Okay, if you're going to look at those platforms, then I'm going to create content on those platforms. And the cool thing about creating content on those platforms is, guess what? You might be scrolling in your bed at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday morning when you should be going to sleep, but you aren't. And there I pop up. And you're like, oh, that's Dr. D. And then I teach some sort of lesson about, why, people thinking Alaska is an island. And suddenly you learn something interesting. And in that 1 minute, I was able to teach you. And I was actually more successful at teaching you in that 1 minute where I popped up in your feed at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday night than I was in my hour and 15 minutes of you sitting in my class and trying to get your attention to look over here, right? So meet the customer where they are. And so, I eventually embraced this. Nobody likes, I work with a lot of clients, and, they're generally older people. My skill in life is, aside from working with young kids, is convincing older people, old with some air quotes, but older people that like social media matters and they should be on it. And of course, none of them want to do it. And like, I don't want to see myself on video. I'm not comfortable. Like, listen, this is how people communicate now. Get used to it. So I don't love being on video, but I've gotten used to it. And so I forced myself to do it because that's where my constituency was. I started creating content, and it's been terrible since then. but a different kind of terrible than most entrepreneurial journey. It's been its own kind of wild ride of successes and failures, just amplified so much quicker. In the startup world, you have a success. Your successes and failures are a lot slower in the startup world than they are in the social media world, which is just like a constant emotional roller coaster. It literally within seconds, I will get a comment on a video that says, you are the worst human being. You should be fired. I can't believe Duke University let you teach. And then the very next comment on the same video will be, you sound like the most amazing instructor ever. I wish I had a professor like you when I was in college. I'm like, well, that's some whiplash.
Both comments were me.
The reason I know that's not true is because you would just say it to my face in class.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm curious as to, I think with social media, especially for people starting out, part of the human condition is this idea of the spotlight effect, in which people feel like no matter what they're doing throughout life, that people are watching them a lot more than they actually are. I mean, people have their own lives to focus on, but yet we all feel like we're the center of our own worlds. And this is really apparent on social media, in which people feel like they're sort of sharing themselves with the world. A lot of people think it's very embarrassing. And on top of that, I think there are a lot of like common misconceptions about social media. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that, and you think why people have so much fear about it, and why in reality it's not actually as bad as it seems.
So this is something I'm often telling my students is, they get embarrassed. They'll put up a video that doesn't get a lot of views, and they'll take it down because they'll be embarrassed by it. And I was like, no, you're missing the point. If your video didn't get any views, by definition, it means nobody saw it. There's nothing to be embarrassed by because nobody saw it. The ones you should be embarrassed by are the ones that got 30 million views. Those are the ones people saw, and you're going to be in the grocery store, and people are going to come up to you and be like, "Hey, you're that guy, I'm that guy." And so it's why. So that's one of the big misconceptions, right? Is the idea that oh my gosh, people are gonna I should be embarrassed by the things that nobody saw. Another big misconception that I'm constantly fighting, especially with so I work with a lot of the student athletes here on campus and try to think about like how do they create more content and use their platforms, and people are y'all are, and you're maybe part of this generation too, protective of your Instagram accounts. You don't want to post too much on Instagram. Like it's okay maybe to post on like Snap or TikTok, but like Instagram, heaven forbid. And and the logic is usually like, well, I don't want to clutter people's feeds. I don't want to show up too much in people's feeds and and them to hate me for that. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're missing the whole point of this enterprise. The whole point of us being here is to get into people's feeds. And do you know how much of a blessing it is to get into people's feeds, especially more than once in a day? Oh my God, like that just doesn't, you just don't get it. Like that's the gold. And so the fundamental thing you're trying to do, which is get in front of people, is the thing people are like, well, I don't want to bug people. No. Bug people. That's you should be so lucky. It's really hard to bug people on social media. And then a third big misconception that I see all the time that I think goes to this spotlight effect idea is lots of creators worry that I already did a piece of content kind of about this. I can't do that again, or that's too similar to what I did before, as though the people watching you are hanging on every piece of content you make and know exactly what you did. But of course, the truth is you are much more aware of your content than anyone out there. And, this is something actually I discovered very early on in my corporate, when I was using social media for like my company, way back before I was even personally doing it. So, it's like a decade or so ago, we were on Twitter. And what we found is, we like hired interns to like curate articles about kind of our space, and then they were given to me and I would put them on Twitter. And it was just, and I guess our intern, finished up their summer, and we were debating well, should we pay someone to go out and get these articles? And we, and my co-founder was like, well, why don't we just put up something, like the old articles were good, right? Like they're not timed, they're still great. Like, why don't we just repost the things you already posted? And I was like, no, I can't. I've already posted that on my Twitter account. Heaven forbid. It was like, no, let's just try it. And you know what? Not once did anyone ever complain that I posted the same article? So we've built this cadence where we'd take the same 30 articles and post them every month. And nobody cared. Nobody noticed, right? There was zero recognition that, that we were doing this. And that kind of goes into it, right? And the way I always like to describe it is, hey, Harvey, what was the last TikTok you watched? Do you remember the last TikTok you watched?
Yeah, I was rewatching the one of me on your TikTok page.
Well, that tells us a lot more about you than it does about the answer to my question. But go ask your random friend, like, hey, what was, do you remember the last TikTok you watched? And they'll like kind of have a deer in the headlights looks like, no. And like, okay, do you really think people are going to remember your TikTok? And the answer is no.
The only reason I had an answer to that question is because I was listening to a podcast of you earlier as research, and you brought up that same thing, and so I made sure to have an answer to that question.
Fair enough. Curses. Well, that's the this is the problem of we're like here's the best outcome. So let's say the best outcome of you repeating yourself or showing up multiple times in someone's feed is that they actually remembered the thing you were trying to tell them.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's the bad outcome we got. It's like, oh yeah, because the truth is, we know in marketing, I never remember the exact stat, but any marketing, they'll just come up with a different number. But the stat is basically like, people need to hear about the same product 15 times before they're ready to buy, right? Or whatever the number is. X, I've heard people say 8 times. I've heard people say 200 times. Whatever it is. The bottom line is people need to hear the same thing over and over again. And this has been like one of the wildest things about teaching. Again, I'll let you in a little professor insight of like leading your class is that I will say things very explicitly, like instructions around an assignment or, where we're going to meet in class, what we're going to do, whatever it is. And the number of people who don't hear it is absurd. And at first I thought, I must have just not said, I guess I just didn't say that thing I thought I said because these people didn't hear it. So maybe I didn't say it. But then what starts to happen is when you're doing this over and over and over again, what'll happen is like 10 people will do it right, and then 5 people just won't do it at all, and they'll say, I didn't hear you say that. And you're like, well, these other 10 people did it, so I had to have said it. But
Yeah.
it's wild just how little of what we hear we actually listen to and maintain, right? So we probably only listen to and maintain like 10 to 15%. So even this podcast, no matter what I am saying right now, anyone listening to it, they're only going to maintain, even in that moment, 10 to 15% of it, which is just wild.
And on top of that, people will choose what they want to, maintain depending on their own biases. I actually, it struck a chord with me what you were talking about with regard to Instagram and social media is because from our perspective, when you're posting a lot and you're developing this persona, like I heard you earlier on the other podcast talking about how you have a difference between your personal self and then Dr. Dinin online. And so you can sort of like have a change between the two. Whereas I think for the average Gen Z user, their online presence is their self. And so anytime someone comments badly about them or says something mean about them, they feel like they're being personally attacked. I also think people spend a lot of time curating their profiles aesthetically, not really to get views from new audiences, but rather from new friends and people they meet in terms of like connecting with new people. And so I think even for basketball players, they feel like, upset and don't want to post because they don't want it to change how their feed is presented and how it's perceived.
Yeah, it's you kind of in your own description of it, you kind of pointed out the contradiction, which is like, oh, we feel like that's ourselves, but we highly curate it. So it's not actually ourselves; it's the presentation of ourselves that we want to put out into the world.
Yeah, but I think people like the idea of being able to present what they should be like. But whereas when you put out a reel or you try something, I think there's some element of vulnerability in that people can decide whether or not to like it, and the number of views is stated. Whereas with a post, you can now even hide the number of likes, and so I think people feel a lot more protection behind that.
I so I've come around to thinking that that a lot of I always have to be careful, right? Because I say like you're creating a character online, and it's not you; it's a version of you, some aspects of you. And again, I think people do that. They do it naturally. They don't realize. By the way, we should also mention this is not at all limited to online. I guarantee you behave differently in my classroom than you do when you're hanging with your buddies. Right, like you're a different character because you understand that you're in this space I'm supposed to act like this, and in this space I'm supposed to act like this, and that's totally fine, right? That's very natural. That's very human. What I always say when I kind of push this character thing is not that you're being disingenuine. I always say you're trying to create the best version of yourself. It's the you wish you always could be, but we just all can't be that perfect. So my social media character, Dr. Dinin, is I wish I could be as cheeky and funny as him regularly. I wish I could be as articulate. I wish I could not say like and nearly as much as I do when I'm lecturing for an hour. What happens, right, is, in this little 60-second snippet, I can be more charming, more interesting. But when you have to sit there in my class, as you can attest to, I'm sure I'm just not as interesting. And nobody is. And so that's the beauty of what social media allows us to do. It allows us to curate a story for ourselves of what we kind of wish we could be all the time.
I think if one was a skeptic of social media, it's nice to like bucket it into this is just what kids are doing, or they're just doing silly dances on TikTok. But there is so much money and so much influence coming out of social media. For example, you've got the Mr. Beasts of the world with Feastables. You've got, KSI and Logan Paul with their prime drink. And then even the new president of the United States, Donald Trump, has a huge online following with X. And then also what's being coined as the podcast election, with him going on long form podcasts. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the influence that social media has had on the world and who you think should be on social media.
I love thinking about, again, social media in the context of bigger histories, and if you kind of zoom out, the answer to this because you took my class, but a lot of people don't know, right? I always think that the first digital social network exists before the World Wide Web even exists, and it launches in, I believe it was 1979. It's called Usenet, which was like Reddit but without the pictures. And what you had communities like forming on these platforms. Quick tangent, it was actually launched at Duke University. It was a couple of Duke grad students who launched Usenet. So I like to think Duke is kind of the home of social media. And for better and for worse, I guess you would say there. But here's the thing about social media is it tends to get a lot of crap, right? It tends to have a bunch of people saying, oh, it's ruining the world, social media is terrible, blah, 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 blah. Sorry, I shouldn't blah, 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 because, there are negative externalities of social media. But here's the thing, of course there are. These are platforms that reach billions of people, billions with a B, right? Enormous amounts of people. And so anything that reaches that many people is going to have negative impacts. And I like to liken it to a plane crash, which is a weird concept, but let me get back to it, right? When you're hearing all these discussions of a plane crash, what nobody is mentioning is the millions of people who flew today who didn't have their planes crash. And so what we do is we talk about the aberration instead of the boring thing, which is what normally happens. And I think that's what happens with social media too, is it's easy to point out the aberration. And oh, by the way, you got to listen to carefully about who is pointing out the aberrations, right? It is, it's the Today Show, it's CNN, it's Fox News talking about this, terrible, terrible thing that happened because of social media. And oh, by the way, that CNN show has 80,000 viewers, and the person they're lambasting on social media has 10 million followers, right? So it's of course the kind of legacy media is going to shake its fist at social media. Social media has destroyed their businesses. But again, it's rightful to point out these bad things, but nobody points out all the incredible things social media does. So let me go back to Usenet and the early days of social media. One of the first things that happens when you start to have these kind of online digital communities that are distributed is people start to build connections and community around healthcare, around digital kind of health communities. And what those digital health communities were, it's, let's say I have a rare orphan disease, and, that there might not be a lot of people in my area who have that rare disease, or there might not be a specialist in my area who helps treat it, and I kind of feel alone and lonely. But guess what? Aggregated out, even rare diseases have lots and lots of people with them. And so these people were starting to find each other, and they were starting to share information and treatments and support and medical guidance. And suddenly you could get the advice of the leading expert on it, who happened to just be on the other side of the country. And now these digital health communities wind up saving people's lives. I mean, they literally saved lives. They have done incredible research studies thanks to these communities. They've raised millions of dollars. They've cured diseases thanks to these digital health communities. But when people talk about social media, they never talk about the millions and millions of lives that have been saved because of social media. Instead, we talk about that one kid who was cyberbullied. And, again, and I shouldn't say the one. There are lots of kids who have gotten cyberbullied. Cyberbullying is a terrible thing. We need to put up guardrails to help protect those things, while also acknowledging that it doesn't mean we should just get rid of social media, because it's saved millions of lives. So this is I guess one of my pet peeves when we talk about social media and the immense value of social media. I know, so you were talking about value in terms of look how much money you can make, and yeah, you can make money, and that's fine. Listen, I like making money just as much as the next guy. But the thing I love about social media is the immense opportunity to create meaningful value in the world. And there's good evidence that connecting all the people in the world makes the world a better place.
I've got three final questions. The first one being, if you were to look back, if I was to ask someone in 100 years' time, what would you want them to say that your legacy is?
Ooh. I would go with, so there's this phrase that I'm stealing from The West Wing, which is such a weird way to say it, but I love the phrase, so I steal it. I say I'm well aware that I'm writing the first line of my obituary right now, which is to say when I die, they're going to say, Dr. Dinin, beloved Duke professor, blah, 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 blah. And I'm comfortable with that, right? The idea that, if you told me 30 years from now, when I kick it, I'll be 70, which, let's hope I make it that long. 30 years from now when I kick it, I was still teaching classes the day before I passed. And he said, I've helped, call it, 100 students a semester for, by that point, it'll be 40, 45 years. Then cool. Then I've made a meaningful impact on the world. I went to, there was one of my colleagues at North Carolina State University, Marshall Brain. It was a kind of a director of an entrepreneurship program over there. He created How Stuff Works. There was a big kind of 90s, early 2000s media entity that Discovery Channel bought. I think he sold it to him for like quarter $2 billion. So he created that, and he was running their entrepreneurship program, and he passed away tragically a few weeks ago. And I went to his funeral, and it was a bit surreal because I felt like I was kind of seeing my future. But it was packed, and it was packed with lots of former students who kept getting up there talking about how Marshall Brain changed their lives, changed their trajectory. They were there to, go be a, doctor or lawyer or whatever. They didn't know what they were doing, and this guy gave them directionality, and that's my goal too. And it's, and that's, I think, a great legacy. And by the way, I realize it's not with every student. Not every student I have loves me, but what happens is I feel like I can build good connections to students who feel like I'm communicating information in a way that they can get meaningful value from. Just like I did with my, I didn't love all my professors, but the ones that I did really had a huge impact on my life. And if I can pay that forward and create a network and value going forward to my students, then I will say I've done something good in the world.
My penultimate question, I think you've already kind of answered it, but what's next for you?
I'm going to die 30 years from now, still teaching the same social media classes, but hopefully we'll just call them media by then.
And my last question, and I ask this to every guest on Personable, is what is one thing that you would want a listener to take away from this episode?
My penultimate answer was I'm going to die when I'm 70, still teaching the same classes, and I kind of joked about it. And I get the sense that your target market for this podcast are people who want to go become billionaires and wildly successful and things like that. Then you're going to hear me say, I just want to keep teaching, and I will be perfectly happy having accomplished that. And so I guess my big thing takeaway would be like, hey, maybe reframe how you think about success. What is success? And it's so easy to have other people tell you what success is rather than you tell yourself what success is. And I dealt with this a lot in my companies. I had a company that raised millions of dollars and ultimately, failed. And I'm going to put failed in air quotes for anyone who's just listening to this, and say, it ultimately failed. And, and I felt really badly about that for a long time until I looked back and I started to realize, well, let's describe failure here. Well, raised millions of dollars and had this venture that existed for, I think it was 4 or 5 years. Had, a dozen employees who, they got their families fed and, and did something they were proud of and passionate about. I learned an absolute metric ton doing this venture. and use that knowledge to go on to other ventures and to now even be, a teacher and educator of this stuff. And so, like, did I really fail? Like, was that actually a failure? Yeah, like the company didn't go on an exit for $1 billion, but it's really, really hard for me to convince myself that that company failed, that there was anything failure about that. And so, but when I was defining my success by this idea that it had to be $1 billion company or bust, I just felt terribly about myself. But when I really started to analyze like what I took away and the value of it, it was just immense. I can't believe other people basically paid for me to get that incredible education. Like, woo, that was pretty cool. So yeah, be careful how you define success would be the thing I'd encourage people to take away, especially a podcast like this, especially when you have some great guests. Look at the guests and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm sitting here talking compared to some of the other guests. But it's real tempting to see those other guests and be like, oh, that's what success looks like. Kid, that is, your success is what you get to define. And so make sure you define it in a way that makes you feel like you're creating value in the world.
I think what's fascinating on that last point you made about seeing that comparison to the other guests is, whilst I don't think it is always good to compare yourself to other people, I think there are some exceptional lessons that can be learned from billionaires, that can be learned from Oscar winners, that can be learned from Olympic gold medalists. It doesn't mean that I am going to become like them, although that might be my aspiration, and similarly for all my listeners. But at the same time, I think there are things you can take into your own life. And I think what you said about redefining success is incredibly important, because it's not about, making that Oscar-winning film. It might just be about producing something in the first place. I think your journey is fascinating. I love how you pivoted.
I gotta add into this, which is like, yes, and, right? So the class, yes, and yes, there are incredible lessons you can learn from that billionaire and that filmmaker. There are also incredible lessons you can learn from the middle manager who's been in that company for 35 years, right? And once you remember that, that's when you as a person will get a lot more value out of all the interactions you have in life.
On that, I really appreciate you, going to Duke, going into the startup world, and coming back to teach the amazing students and myself. And I'm really inspired to, keep going with social media myself, keep seeing what my peers are able to accomplish, and keep seeing how you build your own audience over time. So thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Dinin.
Thank you for having me.